with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight, which I think just about everybody probably knows. You have Ian Baker here. He has been a greenhouse manager and professional grower for more than 15 years in the ag research, plant breeding, and ag tech space. He's a lifelong horticultural and bonsai enthusiast. He's been really getting into bonsai the past 6 years, and he is also a licensed pesticide application. So pay attention tonight. You guys will learn how to keep your trees nice and healthy and pest free. I'll hand it over to Ian.
Thanks, Bob. All right, well, there are going to be a few mea culpas tonight, and the first one is that I had a printer problem that I didn't discover until I arrived. So we have a handout. I have 6 complete copies of it, and I have a bunch of incomplete copies. So you guys can fight it out for who gets what, but we're definitely going to email this out in a couple of days here. So you'll get it, and it will also be on our website. The agenda tonight, there's going to be a lot of information, and I certainly don't expect you to memorize everything. I do this professionally, and I do not keep all of it in my head. But I think the main take home is going to be understanding some of the trends, some of the important ideas, and that will inform your pesticide program, your spraying, but also thinking about your complete sort of horticultural program. There has to be a small biology lesson. I'll keep it as brief as I can. I'll discuss integrated pest management, which is the pest control philosophy that I learned and that I use. Then we'll go into some details with the principles of pesticide use. And we'll end up sort of going over my handout. So I'll show that up on the screen. You guys can follow along until you find the back page missing. And then, yeah, we'll go from there. Feel free to ask questions as we go. I will do my best to restate them. So Bob introduced me. I've been working in the greenhouse space for 15 years, over 15 years. It's sort of at the intersection of research and production, and I've been back and forth from UC Davis to Plenty, joined Bio, currently at Norfolk Healthy Produce, which is a tomato breeding company, and we have the only fully purple flesh tomato on Earth, if you want to talk about that another time. I gave the same talk in 2022, and at the time I had a lot less experience with bonsai pest control. And I've learned a bit more about what's relevant to bonsai and what's not. I still come at it from this IPM point of view. So hopefully this is more useful. And then as a licensed pesticide applicator, I have access to pesticides that you don't. And I spent a lot of time while working on this handout isolating products that you can buy. So there shouldn't be anything on there that requires a license, but I just have to warn you that I'm not as familiar with the products that are available to consumers as I am to those that are available to me as a professional. All right, this is my favorite slide. As usual, there is no silver bullet for anything. We did not get into bonsai because it's easy. I know that a lot of people would just like to know what to spray and when to spray it and not have to think about it. And my goal tonight is to convince you that that's not the best route, and that using some critical thinking will get you a lot further in having a successful pest control program. There's plenty of resources online already. If you want to just follow an existing spray program, you know, and I don't mean to diss on what's out there too much already, but there are reasons why that's inadequate and not as effective, and can also cause problems, which we'll get into later. Well, we'll get into actually some of them right now. So pesticide resistance is a real thing. I've seen it. It's evolution in action. So overusing a single pesticide too much in your garden will cause resistance very quickly, especially with quickly reproducing insects like mites. Also, the use of like broad spectrum systemics, like the good old imidacloprid that everybody's been informed to use, can actually cause more problems by killing natural predators of the pests that you're trying to control. So you can actually have this sort of whiplash effect by applying too much broad spectrum pesticide. And then of course the effort to spray by just sort of, we call this method the spray and pray, and just like follow a schedule, spray, that's it. And it does take a lot of effort. And if you build a more targeted program, hopefully you can spray less, frankly. But yeah, unfortunately, pest control is complex. It's a whole profession consisting of a bunch of other sub specializations, you know, entomology, environmental toxicology, regulation, regulatory compliance, horticulture, and on and on. So it's complex. Again, I don't expect you to take all of this home and memorize it perfectly tonight, but hopefully we can identify some trends and some useful points that will help you. There's no substitute for experience as well. So I really encourage you guys to take notes on what you're experiencing year after year in your garden. And you'll begin to see trends that will inform how you do sprays as you go through time. Okay, so integrated pest management, it really comes from the agricultural space, and it's an ecosystems-based strategy that looks at the pest, the host, the environment, all of the factors that cause ideal conditions for a pest. So basically, it basically works from the top down, right? So you got prevention, which starts with plant health. So unhealthy plants are going to be the most susceptible to pests. And those are, of course, all the horticultural factors that we know and love: irrigation, fertilizers, light, heat. Then the next principle is monitoring, scouting, and note taking. So just like we are learning to see our bonsai from a sort of artistic perspective or a technical perspective, I'm encouraging you to learn to see from a pest control perspective as well. And what I mean by that is taking the time to look with intention at your garden from the perspective of, are there pests here? Are there not? So that could be while you're watering. It could be time that you set aside just for scouting. It could be when you're working on an individual tree and you have it in your workshop and you take a closer look at it, or you're repotting it. But scouting means basically to go out into the field and count the number of pests you have in traditional IPM. The next principle is pest ID. So that basically means knowing precisely what pest you're working with. Now, this is important, and we'll get into it in the biology area a little bit, because different orders of pests, different species respond differently to different pesticides. And you don't necessarily need to know everything down to the species, but you need to have an idea of the general buckets or orders that you're working with. Action thresholds. This is one of the real rubs with IPM and bonsai. So in agriculture, an action threshold is the threshold of pests that you can tolerate before it's economically worth spraying. In bonsai, that's usually low to none. And I accept that. Eradication is not really possible entirely, and there are some pests that we can tolerate. But I also recognize that, especially if you're working with, show grade material and you want to show it off, that there's very little room to tolerate any pests. But I'm just encouraging you to open your mind a little bit here. Choosing the right species. So this means working with species that are suitable to your environment. So again, this is an agricultural principle, but maybe, you've got a tree in your garden and it just gets hammered by mites every year. and you just keep spraying it and you're not winning. And maybe it's worth considering, should I have this particular species of tree? And this is coming from somebody who has one of everything. So I understand why you wouldn't want to do that, but it's worth thinking about. Then sanitation. So this means in and around the garden and your workspace. So, no, you're good. So the life cycle of a lot of pests involves overwintering and leaf litter. So keeping leaf litter cleaned up around your garden, weeding not just in the pots but around is critical because weeds can be hosts for a lot of different pests.
Hello,
And then when
Corinne.
it comes
Hello,
to
Sonia.
pathogens,
Thank you.
Sure.
sanitizing
Yeah.
your tools is important also so that you're not
there
spreading fungal,
were a few
bacterial, or
things
viral
that were,
pathogens from plant to plant as you're pruning.
odd.
We'll get into that a little bit later. And then at the last
The
step
first one is
is
that
the
he's
judicious
not
use of
very
pesticides.
transparent. Like when I tried to communicate
So
with him after each visit just to see how did it go, how
I'll do
much
my
time
best to
did you
ignore that until
stay,
Dodie comes out.
and he's not very forthcoming with information.
So everybody wants to jump
and
down here, and
I mean, I
this
know
is where we're
language
going
is an
to
issue,
arrive, and this is
but
where
that's,
the
when
meat
he wants
of
to
the
communicate
conversation is going
something,
to be.
he
But I really
manages to
want
do
you to
it.
consider all these
And
other components
also, for example,
before we
I
jump to
like to be generous
spraying.
just so people, give their best, and if we pay a little more,
Okay, biology lesson.
without being picky about.
Thank you. Okay, so taxonomy, right? Like it's a scientific system for classifying down to the species of an organism. And with pest control, really what we care about is the order. So we'll get into this a little bit later, but you can generally lump pests together by order, and it's not necessary to understand, okay, I have this mite and it's a particular species, or I have a peach potato aphid and it's Mysis persicae. For all intents and purposes, we don't need to know down to the species. There are situations where it is important to know, but you want to have positive ID that the pest that you're treating for, you know what order it's in. This is my stupid mnemonic for remembering that true bugs, so i.e. Like lygus bugs, bed bugs, actually aphids are a true bug, whiteflies are all in the hemipteran order. So here's the one of the main reasons this is important are spider mites insects. Right, they are not. They are arachnids. So this in particular is really important because they're in an entirely different class. They're not even an insect. So you have to be able to select a miticide that will be effective against them if you have them as a problem. And a lot of insecticides will not work on mites, although there's plenty of exceptions to that. Okay, this is another way to look at it. And I think this is actually more useful. So these are the main orders of pests in agriculture and in bonsai. So arachnids, two-spotted mites, broad mites, hemipteran, so the true bugs, aphids, whiteflies, psyllids, scales, mealybugs, lepidopteran, worms, butterflies, moths, thysanopteran is a thrips, hymenopteran, ants and wasps, dipteran, which is good old flies, fungus, gnats, and mosquitoes. So this is important because they have different mouth parts, which dictate what kind of damage they do. And so when you sort of begin to understand that, the damage makes more sense. And we'll look at some pictures later. But like these piercing, sucking insects and arachnids will generally have really fine mottling on the leaves. That's the result of their stylus jamming into the leaf. Whereas, a chewing lepidopteran, i.e. a good old caterpillar, will have far different damage versus thrips, which have this kind of rasping. It's kind of in between those two. I also arranged this sort of by worst and hardest to treat to least worst and easiest to treat. And then metamorphosis, I won't go too much into that. Well, there's another slide in a moment. It matters because certain insects, certain arthropods are easier to treat at certain times based on their development and whether it's true metamorphosis or not. So complete metamorphosis is what we're familiar with. The egg goes to the larva, to the pupa, to the adult. So in this example, the larva is the only creature that's going to cause damage to your plants and with a caterpillar. You know, the adults do not eat your plants. They might eat the nectar, but that's different. Whereas with incomplete metamorphosis, like this is a harlequin bug, they don't really go through this complete pupal stage. Instead, they go through what are called instars or nymphal stages, where they sort of molt their exoskeleton and grow into a bigger and bigger and bigger version of themselves until they're adults. Yeah, we'll get into why that's important later. So in the wild, all pests have some kind of predator, and IPM is an ecological based practice. So it's about understanding that pests have a predator. There are other insects that come along and eat the pests that we don't like. And sometimes the actions we take with pesticides can actually hurt the predators that we want to preserve. So often broad spectrum insecticides can cause more harm by knocking down a predator population, allowing, and then if there's resistance, say in the mite population and the predators are knocked down, you open up a niche for the population to blow back up again. So there's also parasitic wasps. These guys are great. They lay an egg inside of the aphid, and then the egg develops inside the aphid and it emerges out of the body of the aphid, like some kind of science fiction thing. And the cycle continues. So like with aphids like this, when you're scouting, if you see what are called mummies, so the bodies of the aphid that have a massive ejection hole, that's a fantastic sign. These wasps, by the way, are like a millimeter big, so it's not like a yellow jacket when you think of a wasp, versus a predatory mite, which is just like, I'm going to eat you. All right, open question. Just yell it out. No, that's right. So that is the teenage phase of a ladybug. Another reason it's important to be able to ID your pests, right? Because this looks like some kind of crazy thing that you don't want in your life. Actually, it's just this cute ladybug. Although ladybugs, they kind of like are presented as cute, but they're actually like super vicious and just like gobble down whatever's in front of them. All right, we'll do this really quickly here. So the point here is that you need to have all three factors align in order to have a problem. So the pest or pathogen, the host, and the environment. So if you take one of these out, you won't necessarily have a problem. In this specific example, I've got a Quercus kelloggi, a black oak, as the host. So this is in our bonsai garden. The pest is the California oakworm. And then in the environment over here, like in our yard next door, we have a coast live oak. So most of the time, this is not evergreen. These drop their leaves, and there's no they can't hold the pest over winter. But if we have this live oak outside, these are evergreen, and there's always going to be a home for the oakworm to live in. And then if we have a really hot summer and a lack of predators and the ideal overwintering environment, it opens the door for California oakworm to come and eat our black oak, right? It's a pretty simple concept, but all three of these have to align for there to be a problem. All right. We're moving faster than I thought we would, which is a good thing. So we talked about the sort of practical application of IPM. We'll go into a little bit more detail on some of these points. So plant health and sanitation. Irrigation, it's all about the Goldilocks zone. This is true for bonsai, it's true for agriculture. You don't want to overwater, you don't want to underwater. What's that exactly mean? Well, it's an art. And with bonsai, you've got a bunch of different species at different stages of development and different soil types. So could you make it any more complicated? No. Generally speaking, when you're keeping your soil too wet, you open the door for pathogens. And it's important to allow a period of dry down. And this is the part that's really hard for people, myself included, as a greenhouse manager. It's easy to overwater plants. It's really hard to have the courage to let it dry down to the right point and then water it. And usually that means letting it dry down within a day period, right? So like watering and then stopping watering with enough time left in the day that it can dry down depending on the season. But also not applying enough water that you're restricting the growth of the plant at all, if that makes sense. Again, it's all about this Goldilocks zone, and there's no substitute for experience. Fertilizer, so, whoops. No deficiencies, obviously. We don't want to be deficient in anything, so that's macros and micros. This talk is not about horticulture and fertilizer, so I won't go into that too much, but you need to have them all there. Also, too much nitrogen, for example, can cause a lot of tender foliage on your plants, and aphids love new tender foliage. So you don't want to over fertilize either, because that can open the door for other pests. Sanitizing your pruning tools. I recommend you use alcohol because it dries quickly and it won't cause rust. I know that's been an issue for some people, but it's not a bad idea to spray a little alcohol on your tools. Maybe if you're not doing it between each plant at the end of each day, make sure they're clean so that you're not transmitting fungi, bacteria, or viruses. I usually use 70%. So yeah, the question was, do I recommend a specific percentage of alcohol? I usually use 70%. It's a little more economical, so I buy it 99 and I dilute it down to 70. But also that little bit of dilution slows down the rate of evaporation a little bit so that there's more contact time with the alcohol. So like 99%, you spray it on, it's just going to evaporate off really quickly. But that's generally enough to kill anything that we're concerned about. I said plant health and sanitation. These are also called cultural controls. You want to manage your ants to manage aphids. So ants farm aphids. It's the coolest thing if you've ever noticed it, but ants actually literally farm, they encourage crops of aphids because they consume the honeydew, which is a euphemism for the excretions of the aphids. So ants can make an aphid problem worse. So while ants are not going to cause a primary problem to any of your plants whatsoever, you don't want them around your garden because they can start a little aphid farm, and that's not a good thing. Spacing your bonsai for airflow. Just about all fungal pathogens and bacterial thrive in excess moisture conditions, and I absolutely know about jamming plants together. It's not a good idea. So make sure that you're spacing them so that there's good airflow amongst each other and within your garden. Okay, spraying foliage with water to knock down pests. I'm going to tell you to do this, and I'm also going to tell you not to do it at various times. Again, it's about this Goldilocks zone thing. So you generally don't want standing water on your foliage, especially with like broadleaf deciduous trees. But also junipers really like to be misted, right? So again, it's about if you're gonna like use water, and so what I'm talking about here is using your hose to knock down insects, right? If you have a really bad infestation of spider mites, you need to come in and spray. What I would do first is get the hose and a blaster that's not going to destroy the plant, but it'll knock the spider mites off, send them off into oblivion. There'll be a lot less on the plant and it'll be a lot easier to spray your pesticide. But from a pathogen perspective, you don't want a lot of standing water on your leaves for excessive periods of time. So timing that again, so that there's enough time to dry down by the end of the day, generally not an issue. In peak summer in Sacramento, it's really hard for foliage to stay wet. And then another point is inspect your new trees before placing in the garden. So when you buy something from here, from a nursery, anywhere, and you're bringing it home, it's a good idea to really take a close look at it and make sure that you're not introducing something new into your garden. Okay, monitoring and scouting. So again, this is about intentional, mindful looking for pests. And that can take multiple forms. So you can be out setting time aside once a week to walk through your garden just to look for pests. I recommend everybody have a loop, just like a simple jeweler's loop is super valuable when you're trying to have a close look at anything in your garden that's small, but especially pests and especially the really small ones. And take notes while you're doing that. Again, so then you have a yearly record of what you're seeing in the garden. Sticky traps, which I also have a few of here, and in fact, there's some in the raffle as well, which we'll talk about. These are great because they help with scouting. So if you have them up in your garden, flying insects are like thrips are like, oh, I really love that blue color. They get stuck to it, and you can look at it and say, oh, I've got 30 thrips here since last week. That's a lot. Maybe I should do something about it. But also these help control because, you know, once they stick to it, they're not leaving. So it's kind of like this dual action advantage to using sticky traps. Thrips are attracted to the blue ones. Whiteflies are attracted to the yellow ones, more or less. Yes. Like a jeweler's loop. Oh, Clarence asked what a loop is. I can't really, I'll hold it up for Zoom first and then you can take a closer look at it. But you know, you imagine like a diamond dealer that's like, oh yeah, that's worth $10,000. This one's actually got a little light. The battery's dead on it, but I can turn the light on, which really helps to see what I'm looking at. Yeah. While you're scouting, it's important to be able to recognize the good guys, be it the ladybugs or the parasitic wasps. Again, I concede it takes a lot of effort to learn all of this, and I've learned it through many years of experience. But when you begin to identify them, I don't know, I think it does make sense, but look closely. Sometimes they're not all bad. Also recognizing the difference between abiotic stress and pest damage. So, you know, you're seeing some gnarly looking foliage. Maybe it's because the sun scorched it or your neighbor sprayed herbicide and it's not from a pest, right? And I think one of the best times to scout is when you're working on your plants, and especially when you're repotting. This is massive, right? This is the one time a year you get to see the roots of your plant. Really, the main issue with roots is root mealybugs, and if you're not repotting, you're not going to see them. But just having that plant in your workshop in front of your eyes without any distraction is a great time to have a close look. severe damage to foliage is a lagging indicator. So when you are seeing lots of webbing from spider mites and a lot of stippling, that means they've already been there. And it's past time to treat for it. A lot of horticulture is forensic, and it's trying to figure out what happened at some point in time in the past. And it's not only one thing that happened, but what combination of things happened in the past. So we talked about the loop, we talked about the sticky traps. This is a really key way to scout for two-spotted spider mites. So just a nice clean, and thrips also, a nice clean sheet of white paper below your leaf. You tap it, you see what falls off. If you don't have a loop, the next step is to smudge it. And if you get some streaks from animal carcass or organism carcass, then you know you've got some kind of bug there. But if you have the loop, then you can look on the paper and see what you're working with. All right. So I know this is what we all want. We want to talk about pesticide use. Well, first we've got some stuff to go through here. My goal is to sort of undo the spray and pray method and the overuse of broad spectrum systemic insecticides. And there's some very good reasons why we need to consider that. So generally, whether in my bonsai garden or at work, most of the time I'm spraying insecticidal soap, potassium salts, mineral oil, sulfur, or like a cinnamon rosemary oil first. This is my go-to. And you'll find that these are effective on a lot of different arthropod pests. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Then, I do have sort of a next phase of softer, which can mean multiple things. It can mean less mammalian toxicity, less environmental toxicity, but it can also mean there are pesticides that actually target pests but are softer on their predator. I mean, there's some really advanced chemistry out there with pesticides. And this is a lot of the newer stuff. So like Pylon is an example of that. I kind of don't know why I put azadirachtin in here because it's more of a broad spectrum, but it's a thing that I think it comes from neem oil, but it's an insect growth regulator. But it's actually considered organic. So I have a lot of, well, we won't get into the philosophy of whether organic matters or not, but I use a lot of organic pesticides because they're cheaper and easier to deal with sometimes. Then the last step is pulling out the nuclear options when they're needed. And there are a few good reasons why you want to reserve these for when they're really needed and not just hammer them in on a spray and pray method on a schedule. So yeah, neonicotinoids, for example, imidacloprid. So say you've got borers, which can be a lot of different insects. It can be a beetle or a moth that's boring into the wood of your conifer. You have to use a systemic material for that. Like none of these soaps or mineral oil, sulfur, and nothing else on the handout is going to work with borers. So like imidacloprid is critical for a situation like that. And then pyrethroids are a class of pesticides that actually come from chrysanthemums, but there are a lot of different forms of it, and they're more broad spectrum, highly effective, but it's considered a botanical insecticide. We'll talk a little bit about phytotoxicity in a little bit, but when you start to expand your knowledge of different pesticides, the next thing you need to consider is the compatibility of them. So one of the big no-nos is mixing oils and sulfur directly. So you can mix soap and sulfur and that's fine, but you can't mix oil and sulfur, or you don't want to use them within 3 weeks of each other. Because it can cause phytotoxicity. Yeah, so there's a slide on that in a moment. Basically, phyto, plant, toxicity. So it's when you use a pesticide and it causes an unwanted effect on the plant. More often than not, it's not the pesticide itself, but it's the formulation of the pesticide or the carrier that causes the phytotoxicity. Yeah. Exactly. So yeah, exactly. More light sensitive. Oftentimes there's a correlation with excessive heat. Um, Many products will say, don't apply this when temperatures are above 85 degrees or something like that. More light sensitive is definitely one way that that can happen. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. All right, this is something I want to call out here. So most people are familiar with consumer level pesticides because this is what's easily accessible. You go down to the hardware store and you're like, oh, I need to spray something. What do we got? These are pre-diluted. So most of the time they're pre-diluted. So you don't have to think about, oh, how much do I need to add to how much water to get the right dosage? They really focus on the brand name. So it's really hard to tell like what's actually in this. What's it do? Oh, it's Captain Jack's. All right. What's that? Um, and that just kind of annoys me because like I like the idea of having an easier to use pesticide, but like we should still be able to understand what the active ingredient is in it. I'll talk a little bit more about active ingredients, but a lot of these consumer products kind of do their best to cover that up. And well, generally they're cheaper, but actually that may not be true because they're pre-diluted versus pro pesticides. So careful dilution is necessary. This is where they can get kind of hard. You have to be able to do some dilution math. Sometimes a pesticide will recommend an application based on a dilution. So add 1 ounce per gallon of this material. Sometimes it'll say use 1 ounce in 1 acre. Well, what's that mean? And you have to do some math to figure out what the surface area of your garden is to determine the right dosage rate for your garden. Most of the products you see will just have a dilution rate, but the surface area situation is a little bit tricky, and it's taken me a bit of time to be able to handle that efficiently. There's a lot more options, a lot more active ingredients in this pro side. So when you're looking at the consumer side, you've only got a few options with a few active ingredients. Over here, there's a lot. Even without a license, there's a lot that you can buy. They're harder to find. Again, harder to dilute. They can be more effective. And again, I don't know why I wrote more expensive here, because when you do the math, a lot of these might be more economical. So you might have to pay $120 for a bottle of Floramite, but get 3 years out of it versus $20 for the Bio Advanced and get a month out of it. Everything on the list I'm going to hand out, you should not need a license for. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. So the question was, do you need a license to buy these? I'll talk a little bit more later about where to find them. And a website I recommend actually allows you to filter on if it's available in California and if it's available without a license. I was actually really surprised how many pro products are available for purchase without a license. So there's a lot of stuff out there. But all the really good stuff you need a license for. Yeah. Haven't seen that on the market for a while. Haven't seen the DDT. All right, so I'm going to get on my soapbox here about labels. If you're going to spray a pesticide, you have to be able to read and understand the label. You're undertaking a particular responsibility when choosing to spray a pesticide, and there's a lot of really important information on that label. And it's not, I mean, we'll talk about it. It's not just like environmental safety or mammalian toxicology, but also things that are really relevant to your plant. So let's dive into it. Resistance management. Pesticide resistance is a very real thing. Again, I'll really hammer this home. I've seen it. I used to work at UC Davis. And even though we did rotations of different classes of pesticides there, we had populations of, like, for example, a two-spotted spider mite or a greenhouse whitefly that would not respond to the pesticides they're supposed to respond to. That happens because if you spray a product over and over and over and over again, and you have this population and 99% of it dies, well, what's the one that doesn't die have that the others didn't? Some kind of trait that allowed it to survive that spray. Well, then it reproduces and that population grows and grows and grows. And then over time, you have this population of pests that can take a bath in this stuff and they don't give a damn. This is very real and it happens fast. So this is one of the main reasons you don't want to use the same product over and over and over again, especially on short life cycle pests like a whitefly or a spider mite. There's also different formulations of pesticides. So, like, for example, wettable powders or like prills or granulated formulations, dust, liquid, concentrates, emulsifiable concentrates. So you can have the same active ingredient formulated different ways that can be labeled for different uses.
What are prills?
They're like granules. Like so like merit, for example, is systemic and you apply it to the soil. It's like a prill is the form. Also, your label is going to tell you if that pesticide should be used on a plant. So you'll find different pesticides with the same active ingredient. It might be formulated to go on a dog. You don't want to spray that on your plant, although we have an example where that's not the case. We'll talk about that later. Generally with bonsai, we're in this broad ornamental category. So it's not like, oh, I have a pine and I've got a euonymus and I need to know every single species in my garden. There are a lot of pesticides that are labeled for ornamental use, and that just sort of means floriculture, nursery, broad category of like ornamental plants. Your label is going to tell you human health info. I'll show you an example of a label in a moment. But there's a system and it kind of makes sense, kind of doesn't. But these trigger words, caution, warning, danger. So this is the least toxic to mammals, moderately toxic, most toxic, caution, warning, danger. And then there will actually be, first aid information on the label as well. It's also going to tell you what PPE or personal protective equipment to wear for the pesticide. I'll go into detail on that in a little bit. The label is going to tell you about the pollinator environmental health. So which pesticides are super toxic to honeybees and pollinators, which are not. best times to spray them if they are toxic. The big ones, obviously, don't spray when the flowers are blooming. There's pesticides out there that are super toxic to like aquatic invertebrates and fish and that sort of thing. So there's specific instructions about like when and where to apply it, when and not to apply it. All right, so a little bit more on phytotoxicity, right? So this is causing unintended toxicity in the plant as a result of your pesticide application. So there will be information on your label about known phytotoxicity issues if they're known. But these companies that make these products have to do a lot of testing to determine these things. If it's going to be labeled for XYZ species, they have to test on all of them. So there's usually good information on phytotox info. So whether it's like, don't apply sulfur when the heat's above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, otherwise you might cause some burning. Don't apply sulfur and oils together, as an example we talked about. Phytotoxic effects can be kind of unpredictable, I'm afraid to say, because the environmental factor, water chemistry, and other factors can change circumstances. And I have seen a product that I've applied 90 times, and then the 91st time it caused a phytotox effect. It happens. You shouldn't be too scared of it, but be aware that it can happen. I do a lot of tank mixing. We're not going to talk too much about that tonight, but when you have to spray a large area, and so you have to spray a fungicide, and you have to spray a miticide, and you have to spray a pesticide, you put it all in one tank and you spray it together. And you can do that at home. The label will tell you if that's acceptable. But sometimes tank mixing can also exacerbate phytotoxicity. Usually there's information about it on the label. Always test new products on high value plants before you just douse it. So I'm going to give you a list of a bunch of new pesticides probably to you. And if you choose to go out and acquire them, you don't want to just spray it on your most developed, highest value trees. You can dilute a small portion. So the question was, how do you test it? You can dilute a small portion and test like a small area of foliage. You can test the same species. Maybe you have a really nice Shimpaku and you've got some smaller ones and you're okay with trying the smaller ones. Something like that. This is one of those things that's like, I'm going to really encourage you to do it, but like, how does that work in the wild? Kind of iffy. There's no substitute for experience, right? Also getting feedback from experienced growers in the club who've had their own issues with phytotoxicity. All right. I made this massive list we'll hand out. I did not put any dilution rates on there. And I really don't like the idea of telling you guys dilution rates. There are documents on the internet from other bonsai nursery growers that have dilutions on them. And you can go find those if you want to. You have to be able, if you're going to spray pesticides, to read the label and determine the dilutions yourself. So a lot of products have different rates. So there'll be a range of use. There's a low range and a high range. And if it works on thrips and mites, you might use the low range on thrips and the high range on mites. Yeah, so the range can vary by crop pest. Generally, you want to start with the lower range if it's a range, and work your way up as needed. You never exceed the labeled amount. There's no reason to. You're wasting money at that point. These products are tested for efficacy, and adding more is not going to help you, and it can just cause damage. So I mentioned active ingredients already. This is really important. So we're going to look at a label. This is the active ingredient in the pesticide. So there's a brand name. Sultan miticide. This is the active ingredient, cyflumethafen. I don't expect you guys to walk around knowing what they are, but when you begin to recognize them, you will understand that there are a bunch of products that have the same active ingredient with different brand names and different formulations. So WP is wettable powder. Again, formulations have different uses. Usually it's like on the website that I'm going to show you, products will be very clearly labeled, whether it's for like a pet or structural termite control versus ornamental plant control. But there will be different product names based on having a different formulation that are the same active ingredient. The reason why this is important is because if you are going to rotate your pesticides so that you're not causing resistance, you need to know that you're using a different active ingredient. Some pesticides have what's called this IRAC classification. And this is an even more convenient way. Actually, don't remember if I included a slide, but it's a more convenient way to understand the mode of action. So a step further than understanding the active ingredient is understanding the mode of action. So it's like, how does this pesticide kill is what the mode of action is. And if you've got a group 25 acaricide and you need to rotate something else in, you choose something that's not a group 25. You choose a group 23. Not all pesticides have this IRAC classification, MOA, but a lot do. But this is where it's important to understand your active ingredient. So specific instructions on personal protective equipment, especially with these pro pesticides, it's going to tell you what you need to wear. Follow that. And then this is an example here of the dosage recommendation. So Sultan, the miticide, is super straightforward. It's got one rate. That's it. Sometimes you'll see a table like this that has different crops, different species of plants with different rates for different pests. But this is just like all ornamental, greenhouse, lath house, interior scape, commercial residential landscape. This is what you use, 13.7 fluid ounces per 100 gallons of water. This is a really easy dilution to convert down because you're usually working in gallons, so you just divide it by 100. Right, 0.137 fluid ounces per gallon. There'll also be these hot tips in the directions area. Use when mites first appear, applying sufficient volume of water to ensure thorough coverage. Minimum spray volume. Then it'll also say, do not exceed the maximum seasonal use rate of 27 ounces of Sultan per crop. Do not make more than 2 applications of Sultan per crop growing cycle or per year. So those are the resistance recommendations. So it's going to tell you, don't do this. If you don't want to cause insecticide resistance or acaricide resistance in your mites, follow that. If anybody's interested, this is the IRAC website, so you can actually look up your pesticides mode of action classification if you're really into that kind of dorky stuff. It's an organization that's a conglomeration of different pesticide producing companies that classifies that number. the MOA number into one big database so you can look up your pesticide and know what its mode of action is. The other reason why mode of action is important, again, mode of action is how it kills your pest, right? Different mode of actions work different ways, right? So a neonicotinoid is like a nervous system disruptor. So you spray it on, your pest just like dies. But there are a lot of products that are called insect growth regulators. So they interrupt the molting process. So you spray it on, well, wait, nothing happened. Because you need to apply again in a week or two until enough generations have advanced through that spray to die. Does that make sense? Well, yeah, depending on the mode of action, but yeah. There are ovicidal pesticides that only kill eggs. There are a lot of different examples out there. So, oh, that's the formulation. Yeah. So it's this whole system of acronyms. So WP is a wettable powder. There's EC, which is an emulsifiable concentrate, soluble liquid. There's not too much to worry about with that specifically, like knowing what each one is. I think the more important thing is knowing that your product is labeled for use on the plants that you intend to spray it on. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Clarence asked if I use a mask, and I forgot to bring mine. I meant to. I either use a half face respirator, so like a 3M, the kind of mask a painter would wear. Um, that's going to be way more effective than like an N95 mask, like a COVID mask, right? Because they're carbon filtered, so the carbon is actually able to absorb gases. I also have a full head positive air pressure battery powered respirator if I'm feeling crazy, that it's positive pressure inside of it. So, and then the air is filtered. And that means that there will be nothing getting on my head. A half face respirator is sufficient. The reason I have the full head one is because I don't like to shave. And that allows me to not shave. Yeah. All right, this is a really important one. This is another reason why I'm going to encourage you guys to not hammer the nuclear products from day one. You can no longer buy any imidacloprid or dinotefuran products without a license in California. So I was actually kind of surprised a few years ago to learn that you could just hop on Amazon and buy Merit or Safari. Like, wait, that's weird. Well, it was very quick that California disallowed that. So if you do have a stock of imidacloprid, you want to use that sparingly, unless you know how else to get it. Right. Yeah, yeah. So this class is the MOA is 4, so it's all neonicotinoids. This probably has to do with pollinator health and the overuse of them killing honeybee populations. I don't know exactly. But the problem with this, though, is that there aren't many systemic products on the market. So a systemic pesticide can be taken up within the plant's vascular tissue and live inside the plant's sap, so that when a pest comes along and bites into the leaf, it gets a little taste of pesticide. versus just a foliar pesticide or a contact pesticide does not get taken into the vascular tissue. It only works when it makes contact with the pest when you spray it. That makes sense? Then there's this kind of in between called a translaminar, where the insecticide can flow through a leaf. It doesn't necessarily go through the whole vascular tissue, but it can kind of go to the other side of the leaf. There aren't many systemic products on the market now that we've lost imidacloprid and dinotefuran. There's this new high-tech rosemary oil stuff. I don't know how effective it is, but they say it's systemic, which is super interesting. And there's acephate. I will never spray acephate. You can if you need to. I don't want any of that stuff around me. It's technically only moderately toxic to mammals, but it's a cholinesterase inhibitor, and you just don't want it in your body. But there are situations when that's the only systemic product available to you, and maybe you need to use it. Maybe you have a borer problem on your high-value tree, and you need to get that sucker. But that's it. There really aren't other systemic products. Carbaryl might be. Also, I would not spray that myself. All right, 5 minutes to break. I did bring my backpack sprayer. So first of all, this is battery operated. I mean, these cost a few $100. If you're going to be doing a lot of spraying, it's worth getting something nice. A pump sprayer will get the job done, no doubt. But with this, I just turn it on and it's pressurized. I can actually adjust the pressure. And the point I want to make about it is that it's got this nozzle on it. This is an adjustable nozzle, so I can make it really coarse if I want large droplets, and I can make it really fine if I want small droplets. There are actually a bunch of different kinds of nozzles you can buy with different rates. It gets pretty complicated. Generally, when you're spraying plants, you want a really fine spray. So the reason for that is you kind of actually create this turbulence effect. So you have fine droplets, and because of air turbulence, your droplets are going to hit more of these complicated surface areas better. And when I'm spraying, I'm usually walking backwards because I want to be moving away from where it's spraying. And I'm spraying upwards. So I start by saying, this is a bonsai here. I'm going to spray the undersides of the leaves first and get all the way around it. The underside of the leaves is where most of the pests are. That's the most important area to spray. Then I do a pass over the top. But because I've got a nice fine spray, a lot of that incidental spray has already made it to the top of the plant. So I get the underside thoroughly, and then I just hit the top all the way around, and I move on to the next one. I think this is like a $300 sprayer. Yeah, I mean, again, it gets the job done. Gets the job done. This is my work sprayer, so they make versions of these also that are on a cart. I'm getting old enough that I don't want one of these on my back forever. 4 gallons of liquid is heavy, and they make versions that'll click into a cart so you can tote it along and spray as well. But yeah, it's worth investing if you're going to be doing a lot of spraying. Yes. That's a great point, and I forgot to include that. So the question was, how well does the sprayer have to be washed out in between pesticides? There's this principle, when you empty a pesticide container, you triple rinse it. before you dispose of it. So basically that dilutes whatever's in there enough to where it's safe to dispose of. I basically do that. So I will spray until it's empty. I never mix more than I can spray in one spray session. So you don't want mixed pesticides sitting in your tank for days on end. So that means I don't want to mix more than I can use. So I have an idea that, okay, for my garden, I usually need a 3-gallon volume. I'm going to mix up enough to get that job done. I go through and spray. Hopefully by the end of that, it's perfectly empty. If it's not, then I make another pass. Then once that happens, I take it over and I rinse it out, dump that out, fill it with fresh water again, run fresh water through the hose, dump it out, and do that 1 or 2 more times. So I like it pretty clean. It may not be necessary. I hope I don't need to tell you this, but don't use herbicides in the same sprayer that you're going to spray pesticides in. Don't use herbicides in the same sprayer that you're going to spray pesticide in, ever. Yeah, yeah. Herbicides, different sprayer. All right, we talked about droplet size, so make sure you're getting a nice fine droplet. Tank mixing can be done. Make sure you read the label. I highly recommend you use a spreader sticker adjuvant. So this is a product that you add to your pesticide mix. Usually it's this like super high-tech organosilicon polymer complex. All it really is like a liquid that you add to the tank that helps disperse the water more evenly on the leaf. It's kind of like adding a little bit of soap to your pesticide mix, which is kind of the old-fashioned way of doing it. So it helps the liquid spread out more. It helps it get better coverage on the insect. If you're spraying like a insecticidal soap or an oil, that has the same effect. So you don't need to add an adjuvant to soap or an oil. But if you're just spraying pylon or just a normal pesticide, it helps to add an adjuvant to it. And there'll be instructions. There's a lot of different kinds. This is just Aquatrol's capsule is an example of an adjuvant. Drenches are used for systemics or when you're dealing with root mealybugs. So this basically means dunking your root zone into liquid for long enough that it can take some of that up through the roots. There's also kind of a sprench where you turn your sprayer to really coarse and hit the soil surface enough to really soak the soil. But yeah, you're only doing that if you're treating for a root problem or using a systemic product that gets taken up into the vascular tissue. And we talked about sprayers. All right, let's take a break. Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot more to crank through. I'm going to try to do it efficiently. So I want to make an important point about concentrations and formulations not intended for plants. So lime sulfur is this go-to in bonsai because we use it for bleaching deadwood and we use it for a dormant spray. Most agricultural lime sulfur comes in a 28% bottle. This stuff is for pets. And it comes in a 98% bottle. So this is another reason it's important to know your active ingredient and to know your concentration. It's totally usable. I think there might be some like mild detergents that get added to it, but this is what everybody still uses in bonsai and it's fine. But if you're following the normal recommendation of, oh yeah, you just add 5 ounces to 1 gallon of water, that recommendation is for 28% lime sulfur. This, I did the calc at 97%. This is 98%. You need to be adding 1.5 ounces to a gallon of water to arrive at the same final concentration of 1%. So pay close attention. So this slide is about dormant sprays. So basically this means spraying your trees when they're dormant, December, January, February, depending on what's starting to bud out. And this helps knock down pests that overwinter. So they can be overwintering in like crotches on the tree or sort of in the bark and hard to reach spots, but without leaves, you can spray stuff on it that you wouldn't normally spray, namely lime sulfur. You would not spray that when a tree is leafed out. Also mineral oils like high yield dormant spray are great. JMS stylet oil are great. And insecticidal soap like Impede make a great dormant spray as well. And they're a little bit safer than the lime sulfur. On the chart there, I do talk about dormant sprays. I personally don't have a ton of experience with spraying lime sulfur. I know that people do spray their conifers with it. I've heard that 2-3 needle pines are okay. Shimpaku's okay. But a lot of like needle junipers and other conifers you don't want to spray with lime sulfur. I don't know if that's completely true or not. Speak up if you have experience. And you want to make a few applications over the winter, again, to make sure that you've got everything knocked down. Once plants start to actually bud, you don't want to spray dormant sprays. All right, PPE. I really want to hammer this point home. I learned how to spray at UC Davis, which meant that I learned how to wear a lot of PPE. And we always went for the highest standard from the beginning. And it's been interesting to see people who've learned to spray from other routes and methods, especially like getting paid to spray as like a farm worker where they're not trained to wear PPE. And it's frankly kind of sad. The label is going to give you recommendations, like I pointed out. I actually wear these Tyvek disposable suits, which is probably overkill, but I don't want this shit on my clothes. You can wash your clothes. I would do it in a separate wash than the rest of your stuff, rest of your family's clothes. That's fine. I just like being able to strip the Tyvek off and be done with it. I always wear my half-face respirator at least, and some kind of glasses, or I'll wear my full-face respirator. It's just a good practice, and I highly recommend you do it. It doesn't mean that all pesticides are super toxic and that you're going to die if you breathe in a little bit, but especially if you're spraying, to Clarence's story, to his point, if you're spraying a lot, you don't want to be breathing this stuff in. You don't want it on your skin. You don't want it in your eyes. You don't want it in your mouth. This is where I recommend, if you want to invest some money in some real pesticides, domyown.com, domyownpestcontrol.com. I could pull it up right now and walk you through it, but basically you can search by active ingredient, you can search by brand name, you can search by pest. So if you've got whiteflies, you click on whiteflies and it'll give you a list of products. Everything is listed, whether it can be sold in California or not, whether you need to have a license to buy it. And all of the products I listed on the sheet, I am fairly confident you do not need to have a license to buy. And they're all available at domyown.com. You can buy stuff from the hardware store, but just like my irrigation talk, you're not going to find the best stuff at the hardware store, and it's going to be more expensive generally. So plan ahead, order online. There's other sources out there. Arbico has more organic stuff. They're okay. And then if you're really interested in getting into biological control, which is a whole other conversation, you can buy predators and release them in your garden. It takes a lot more effort and work, but this is a source to do that. And I'm happy to talk with anybody if you're interested. So the way this chart works is each column header. So this is the pest. I mostly used common names over here and not species names. General host plant. I just want to be clear, this is not like an exhaustive list. So if something's not on here, it just isn't true, or there aren't places where things overlap. And also, I'm super open to input, right? Like if any of you have experience that contradicts any of this or is missing, like bring it to me. We'll include it because I absolutely do not know everything. I can only keep so much in my head. This column is symptoms and damage, generally speaking. Life cycle, when to spray. Sometimes it's super specific in here by month. Sometimes it's not. Pest control is complicated. This is the magic list right here. So this is lists the active ingredient, and then in parentheses is the brand name for different products you can use to treat this pest. And I generally list this from top to bottom with things I would start with and things I would end with. And then there's some notes over there. So for example, two-spotted spider mites, you know, they can take residence on just about anything you have. Seems like generally they hammer the Shimpaku's the worst, although they really like my euonymus. And that's something I would have never guessed until I saw it. Their damage is this really fine modeling. This is really severe, but it's, again, it's a stylus that they're poking into the leaf surface. And then when the population gets big enough, you'll actually see webbing on there. So when it gets to this point, like this is like, you don't want to get to this point, right? You want to spray before that. So the question was if I have any experience with ovicidal materials on pine. And I assume you mean with like these Irophid mites. Yeah, this is something I really don't have a ton of experience with. I know that they happen. They're not extremely rare, but they're not the most common mite. The problem with them is they live inside the sheath, right? So they're really hard to spray. So you want to find something that's effective against them and you want to spray it at the right time. Based on what my research was, you want to spray them right when the candles finish elongating out of the sheath, but before the needles elongate. And with these recommended pesticides, again, it's not an exhaustive list. I'm always starting with a horticultural oil, a mineral oil. These have to have good contact. They're not systemic. But if you are looking out for an aphid mite and right after the candles elongate, you do an application and then maybe two more within a couple of weeks of each other, you're going to get good contact with them, with the eggs, with the intermediate stages, with the adults. And this is why timing is so important. I've had a lot of good success with dusting sulfur. I do recommend it. It's really messy. You know, so if you have a tree that you're going to put into a show, you probably don't want to dust it with sulfur. But it's really effective and it's easy to apply. And also there's wettable sulfurs, so you can put it into a mix with water, which makes it a little bit easier to apply, less chance of breathing it, which isn't fun because if you do dust, it remains dust on the plant for days and days and days. So it's one of these trade-off things. If you need to knock something down, move something into the mix, sulfur is a great option. But yeah, you don't want to do it on a show plant if it's about to go into a show. These aphid are really small buggers. So usually you're seeing the damage after they've done it, long after they've done it. I do think you want to avoid broad spectrum pesticides because you might knock down the natural enemies of them. And the other thing I was researching was spraying at the end of the year using a mineral oil and knocking them down before they have a chance to lay new eggs inside the sheath. Red mites generally aren't a problem. You see them, they're not doing much. I wouldn't worry about them. They can cause some damage on prunus and some indoor houseplants, but I personally would not freak out if I saw some red mites. But if you do want to spray port oil, mineral oil, stylate, sulfur, Up here in the two-spotted mite section, I do get into some more specialized mite pesticides. So fluoromite is an option. I know people have some mixed opinions about it. It's worked well for me at times. I know that it's been applied in a lot of places and there might be some resistance. Pylon is the gold standard. It's $600 a quart. 600 at least. I think it's actually higher than that for the California version. Yeah. But man, if you like, I gave Peter a little bit to try. He was happy. He went out and bought some, and it's going to last quite a while. So yes, that's a lot of money, but you're diluting a few milliliters of it into gallons of water every time you spray. So it goes a long way. And this is a great option if you really need to control mites. Now, cultural practices. Mites love hot, dry, dusty conditions. So keep your junipers misted. Junipers like that, especially in the summer, generally. There can be some tip blight, but we're talking about summer here, August, September, July, when it's just hottest. So keeping them moist is going to help keep the spider mites down, and also making sure that they're well irrigated in that peak heat of the summer. Okay, we talked about the aphids. I don't know if you guys can see the bottom row, but this is broadly aphids. For all intents and purposes, we can just bucket aphids into one category, even though there are many different species of them. They generally tend to like broadleaf deciduous plants. Again, they can be farmed by ants, so keep your ants under control. This is classic aphid honeydew. Again, the euphemism for the excrement. And it forms this sooty mold, so they call it sooty honeydew. And you probably see this on ornamental trees on the streets around here in the summer when they're full of aphids. But otherwise, they look like these guys. And then this is a parasitic wasp coming out of a mummy. The way I have this sheet set up is each order is more or less bordered by a thick border. So the top is the arachnids. And then we move into the true bugs, which continues on the next page. So aphids are a true bug, hemipteran. I'm not going to go through and like name every single pesticide on the list. You guys can look at them. You can go to domyown.com. You can search for the active ingredient or the brand name. Some insects are primary pests and they cause primary damage to plants. Some cause less primary damage, but they might vector disease. We're not going to really talk about viruses tonight. That's really just a whole other topic. And viruses are pretty sinister if you do have any plants that are susceptible to them, because there's really no cure. But fortunately, most of the trees we have are not susceptible to many viruses. I work in the tomato industry where tobacco mosaic virus is common, and that's what keeps growers up at night. But aphids can vector virus. So if you let a population get high enough, they could inject a virus that one of your plants could be susceptible to. So that's another reason that you want to control pests, even if they're not like a huge nuisance themselves. So you can hose off your aphids, high pressure water. It's a great first line of defense. Avoid broad spectrum persistent sprays to maintain your predators. In this list, again, you'll see a lot of things repeated over and over again in the active ingredients, sometimes not. I like this IPM product that's from a company called Athena. They make fertilizer primarily for the cannabis industry, but this is a peppermint oil product that's pretty effective. Impede is something I use a lot. And you start getting into neem oil. As a guard, you'll notice insect growth regulator. Again, we talked about that before. These are products that don't kill the insect directly, but they interrupt their mating or they interrupt their feeding so that they die before they can molt into their next phase. So with any insect growth regulator, multiple applications are usually necessary within a short time frame of each other, usually a few weeks, depends on the life cycle of the insect. We didn't talk about degree days. I'm just going to make a broad statement. The warmer it gets, the faster an insect can reproduce. So it's this accumulated heat math model. I think to me that's fairly self-evident, but it's really important to point out. And this is why pests get so bad in summer when it's hottest. They can reproduce in incredibly short periods of time. Like a full life cycle for an aphid is 7 days above 75 or at 75. They actually don't like it when it gets super hot. Mites, on the other hand, oh man, they love it above 82 and they have an 8-day cycle. So if you're trying to knock down mites or aphids 7-8 days apart, you want to do your spray to coincide with that a few different times. So like a week apart. Again, the label will give you recommendations on it. All right, so this continues into the true bug section. So root mealybugs, root aphids, mealybugs, whiteflies, they're still true bugs. Hemipteran, same order. Generally, there's a lot of commonalities in treating them, but with root mealybugs, they're really unique because they're in the roots. You usually don't see it until you're repotting. If you're seeing symptoms in the above ground tissue, that's not a good sign. It means that they've done enough damage to the roots that you're already seeing reduced vigor or wilted foliage, all the way to full plant death. So this occurs mostly in soil that hasn't been changed recently. So if you have something like I had of a black pine that hadn't been repotted in many years and it had root mealybugs, if you have a deciduous that you're repotting every year, it's far less likely that you're going to have an issue in that soil. They have a much slower life cycle, 2 to 4 months in total. But many of these weird woolly mealybugs, woolly aphids, their adult stage, we'll look at a picture in a moment, is very waxy. It looks like a white waxy powder. Really hard to spray those, but their juvenile stage, they're called crawlers. Those are the guys you want to spray. They're super active. So the adults lay eggs, eggs hatch. Then you've got these little babies, they're crawlers. Those are the ones that spread readily plant to plant. And you need to spray such that you're hitting the crawlers because the waxy adult is not going to be able to absorb any pesticide. For mealybugs, you do generally want to try to use something systemic. So something that you can drench the whole root zone in. Again, this Sierra Natural Science Systemic is a new product I found you can try. If you do have some imidacloprid, I won't tell if you use it. Buprofizin is an available growth regulator. You just like quinoprene, you need to do multiple applications of this in a short period of time, not as short as say the mites or aphids because they have a longer, these mealybugs have a longer life cycle. And then you're working your way down to, the acephate, the orthene, bifenthrin, other pyrethroids, if you just like need to knock them out. This is kind of like, oh, hey, this tree needs to go in a show. Stat. All right, so mealybugs are the above ground version of root mealybugs. Again, we were talking about the white waxy masses in the crotches and bark nooks. They will also create a sooty mold honeydew, highly mobile crawler stage. Here's your pesticides, pretty much the same list. This is where using an adjuvant is important. So if you're not spraying an oil or a soap, an adjuvant is going to help you get good contact on the crawler and might be able to permeate some of that waxy body as well. All right, whiteflies, also a true bug, but they fly. Actually, aphids will develop wings under certain circumstances as well, but generally they don't have wings. Similar aphids and psyllids, excrete honeydew, sooty mold. They can also vector some disease. It's kind of a debate in the community. I've heard entomologists say that they don't, and I've heard some say that they do, but I think they can if the populations are high enough. They have a slightly longer life cycle, so 16-day life cycle at 86 degrees, but it's the same deal. All these products are going to help you knock them down. These guys are also really prone to resistance. And there's different biotypes already in the area. I mean, we're in the epicenter of agriculture in California, right? There's thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres of agriculture around us. They're applying pesticides. So we're surrounded by a lot of resistant pests already. And that is very true with whiteflies. So even if you're not the one causing resistance, somebody else is doing it for you. And again, that's why I start with mineral oil, potassium salts. I don't know why that got cut off. Because those are their mode of action is smothering the insect. So it doesn't affect some biological property of the insect, and it doesn't necessarily cause resistance to develop. Yeah, so the question was, where's scale? I included a picture. I didn't include it in the chart. When I go home and fix this, I'll plug in scale. Scales are also a true bug, very similar to the mealybugs in that their adult stage lives inside, well, hey, a scale. Can't spray it, so you have to spray it when the crawlers emerge. But it's the same set of pesticides. Geranium oil, like pyrethroids, come from geraniums. So it's pyrethroids, pyrethrins is a whole class of insecticides. Geraniums have an intrinsic insecticidal quality to them, and pyrethroids are considered botanical. So it's like a more concentrated form of geranium oil, or sometimes synthesized in a lab to be more effective in other ways. But I don't see why you wouldn't try geranium oil. Yeah. All right, caterpillars, leaf munchers. These guys are pretty easy to deal with. They cause a lot of damage really fast, but they're easy to deal with. So the problem is catching them before they cause damage. They're most active at night. I'm not out like every night checking my plants, but it's not a bad idea to go and take a look at night if you do have consistent issues with caterpillars where you are. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Bacillus thuringiensis. It's actually a biological insecticide that comes from a soil bacteria. It's super effective, super safe, and it causes, I don't know the exact mechanism, but it causes this crystallization in the caterpillar's stomach that prevents it from feeding. But this is, BT is the short for that. There are different strains of it. It's a great option for caterpillars. And then spinosad. I love spinosad. Spinosad comes from a soil bacteria. I misspoke earlier about the BT. Comes from a soil bacteria, highly effective. Mostly it targets caterpillars and thrips. So the reason why I love it is it's highly effective against thrips, and there's not a lot of products that are effective against thrips. And there's plenty of consumer products that have spinosad in it because it's so safe, it's readily available. So here's just some visuals. This is what mealybug looks like: white waxy masses, scales, white waxy masses under a shell, whiteflies. And these are actually a really close up of root mealybugs in their sort of crawler stage. More root mealybug pictures. When you see this, you got a problem. All right, we're on to thrips. Different order, Thysanopteran. Thrips is always a thrips. Athrips is athrips. They are a really unique pest. They can cause some primary damage. So similar to spider mites, they do a lot of stippling and inject into the leaf, which makes them really unattractive on broadleaf deciduous plants. Thrips these are the guys that transmit virus and disease also. So you really want to control them. The problem with them is they have this ridiculous life cycle where the egg gets laid inside of leaf tissue, so you can't spray the egg. Then the larva emerges. You can spray the larva while it's around on the leaf. The larva drops to the soil. It pupates in the soil. So you can't spray it while it's in the soil. And then the adult walks back up and lives on the leaf. So you have this sort of larva and adult stage that you can spray it. For that reason, it's also really prone to resistance. If you're not spraying something that's effective against them frequently enough, you're going to have guys that survive. Pylon actually is really effective against thrips as well. Oh, I did include spinosad up here. The commercial versions of this are super expensive, but they'll last forever. And then there's, again, plenty of hardware store versions of it. Yeah, I would do at least 7 days apart. You always, again, I'll keep saying it, you always want to read the label because there will be specific recommendations. But in peak summer, when the heat, you're up in this range, you have an 11-day life cycle. So if you do once a week for a few weeks in a row, you're going to knock down the population. All right, borers, they're really just a special case. This is really where the big guns might be necessary because there's not much you can do about them. You basically need to use a systemic product to take down borers. There are a lot of different kinds of borers. There's beetles and moths and termites. And you might be able to use something that's not systemic if you want to syringe it into each hole and make sure that you're getting each thing if you've positively identified the species of the borer. Otherwise, you're basically looking at acquiring something systemic like good old imidacloprid or acephate, and getting it in there into the root zone so that it's taken up into the plant tissue. Now, if you do have termites, they're in deadwood. There's no live tissue in there, so it's not going to take any pesticide into that. So with termites, you do have to inject it into the holes or figure out ways to get them out by hand, which sounds tedious. It might be necessary. So the symptoms of borers, obviously holes. So, when you see that, you got a problem. And then, sometimes there'll be pitch oozing out of that. It looks really obvious, but sometimes it's hard to see until there's a bunch of them. So if you've got really high value coniferous plants, although it's not exclusive to that, there's plenty of other borers that go in deciduous trees. Really keep a close eye out for this. Pictures of thrips here. So they're modeling similar to mites, but it's subtly different enough. And then there's these black fecal spots. So this is really telltale thrips. All right, we talked about dormant sprays. Know your stock solution, your concentrated solution so that you can dilute it properly. 2-3 needle pines and shimpaku are generally considered safe. Other evergreens, not so much. Azaleas, euonymus, I've heard that you don't want to spray lime sulfur on them. Otherwise, dormant oil, which is a mineral oil, peppermint oil, potassium salts, fantastic options for dormant sprays. Okay, we're into the pathogen section, home stretch. Pathogens are hard. Okay, and when I say pathogens, we're generally talking about fungal infections. There can be bacterial infections. There are some that occur with really easy to identify symptoms, and there's a lot that you can't identify until you get them under a microscope. But the good news is that a lot of the fungal diseases are generally treatable with a lot of the same fungicides. Under powdery mildew, this is the main sort of master list of fungicides. There are a few other recommendations for specific cases down here. Milk, funny aside, is the most effective treatment for tobacco mosaic virus because the proteins break down the virus. But I don't know how many people have gone into their greenhouse and sprayed the walls down with milk. The other great news is that a lot of these oils and soaps that we use on insects are great for fungicide. So Impede, this is the one I spray the most, potassium salts. It does it all. Talk about efficient. There are some more specialized fungicides in the list to add to the rotation. I think that I am more comfortable personally with having fungicides in a regular rotation on a schedule than I am with insecticides. There's still some risk of fungicide resistance. But I think there are a lot of pathogen issues in bonsai, especially in my garden, that I haven't been treating regularly enough, and you really have to have a consistent spray schedule. That said, it does vary a little bit. You know, powdery mildew is the classic fungal pathogen on the leaves. It's mildew, it's powdery. With all of these, too much wetness, the lack of airflow is critical. So yeah, I would recommend that you put together a fungicide spray schedule. Make sure that your plants aren't remaining too wet, that they're remaining too shaded or too close together. That's the first step. Juniper tip blight, I think, is actually more common than I realized until I was putting this talk together. And a lot of you have probably seen something very similar to this. There's actually not really any visible fruiting bodies or black fungus. It's just like, oh, dead tips. These two specific products, propancanazole and manzikeb, are good for tip blight, labeled for it specifically. And it's actually most active in spring with milder temperatures. So as you head into mid and late summer, that's going to slow down and stop reproducing. Doesn't mean it's going to disappear till the next year, but you want to, if you're seeing this, you want to start your applications earlier in the spring. You can also prune off the infected tips and keep a close eye. If you prune them off and nothing continues to die back, great. If it continues to die back, not great. Anthracnose is basically these dark lesions that can appear. It's also fungal, more of a broadleaf deciduous problem. Same kind of deal with the tip blight. It likes this transition zone when it's getting warmer, but it's still really wet. So with all of these, you know, I'll keep saying it, airflow is critical. On the next page, I'll talk about root rot, so I won't at the moment. Needle cast also happens. You get these sort of black fruiting bodies, prematurely brown needles, and then the cast part means they're falling off when they shouldn't. Again, managing moisture is critical, but you can also include azoxystrobin and chlorothalonil in your rotation if you do have issues with those. Okay, root rot, Pythium. Root rot's this really broad generic term, so I don't want to scare everybody and say all root rot is Pythium. Pythium is a really nasty situation. It's a zoospore, so it's like this fungus that swims around in water. So, some of them, I can't remember if Pythium's motile, but it's like, wait, how is this fungus swimming? It's kind of crazy. So the first deal with root rot is like when you're repotting, observe your roots. If you've got anaerobic, like nasty, rotten smelling roots, they're too wet. If they're black, if they're not the nice white color they should be, they're too wet. So that's step number one. We've been fairly dry recently, but when it's raining a lot, you might want to tip your pots if there are drainage holes on the edge to allow them to drain better, prevent standing water. If your holes are in the middle and you tip it, then you're just going to create an area of extra water, so don't do that. You might want to consider moving something out of the rain if it's prone to root rot or sensitive. But it can also be a result of a Pythium. Be hard to really tell, but this is again another reason that having a good rotation of fungicides is going to help. So I don't actually know if we have the Monterey brand, but I think we do have the potassium salts of phosphoric acid. Yeah, so we got that product in the mixed. And then there's a few other, it's kind of, yeah, you will have in the future. And then there's a couple other specific products for Pythium if you do need to deal with that. All right, last one is leaf curl, particularly in prunus, peach leaf curl. You've all probably seen it. It's one of the most common backyard, pathogens. Reddish leaves, cankerous leaf curling. Guess what causes it? Wet conditions in the spring. And it really, when leaves remain wet for longer than, this is really specific, but the research says 12 and a half hours at temperatures below 61 Fahrenheit, you want to treat with a fungicide. And actually some of these like longer lived funguses persist with the plant season to season. So it's really important, like with leaf curl, to treat after leaves drop in the fall and into the winter a few times. It's just like overwintering insects. You want to kill them in that dormant period so that the next season it doesn't have a chance to infect new tissue. Copper octanoate. This is, I listed it in a few other spots. Copper is actually really broadly usable for a lot of different fungicides. It's basically a copper product with soap. A lot of it's labeled organic as well. And you can also use thiram. Root knot nematodes are horrible. They're a pain in the butt if you get them in your garden. The great thing about bonsai is we're generally repotting frequently and things aren't living in the same soil for long periods of time. We have super aerated soil. I don't know like, have you had issues with nematodes? Yeah. I mean, they're a pain in the butt. When you get them in your landscape, they're really hard to treat. And yeah. The advantage though is we're growing plants in a pot in a contained root environment. So if you were to develop root knot nematodes, which you wouldn't know until you were transplanting and you had weird cankerous roots, there are nematicides that you can use that would be fairly easy to drench the root zone in. Yeah, nematodes is a whole other complicated class of both pest and beneficial nematodes. Some of them are actually good and can kill other pests.
We're coming into repotting season. If you are repotting your plant and you spot a problem, whether it's fungal or invertebrate or whatever, is there any guidance on should you treat right away and delay the stress of repotting? Should you do the repot and not add chemical treatment because the stress of repotting plus treatment might be too much? Is there any guidance there?
I think generally speaking, I would continue with the repotting as planned because the plant probably needs it, right? And I would treat it at the same time. There could be some risk of the fungicide stressing the plant more, but it's not going to be more than the pathogen that's there if you are observing an issue. So by all means, get it in some fresh soil, stat, and dunk it. And that also brings up another point. I know a lot of people reuse soil. There are circumstances I will with some plants. Be careful. When I worked at UC Davis, we had a big steam generator and I'd steam all reused soil and it's fine. But the risk of passing a pathogen on in reused soil is pretty high. Oh, I will only reuse soil with like early development plants or collected plants, and I kind of keep it all in one spot. I will not reuse soil, and it's hard because I know it's really expensive, but I won't reuse it in my higher value trees. Okay, wrap up. Keep your plants healthy, your workspace clean, your tools clean. Start by spraying bugs off with high pressure water first, but be careful about having your leaves too wet at the same time. Know your pests, choose smart pesticides, rotate them. Soaps and oils first, save the nuclear options for when you really need them, especially now that we can't buy imidacloprid. Okay, this is the money right here. UCIPM is a website that's been created by the Agricultural Extension. It's got both a home and garden section and an agricultural pest section. There's tons of information in there about the life cycles of pests against all sorts of species of plants and trees, ornamental, agricultural, lists of acceptable pesticides to use. It's the main source that I use where a lot of this information comes from. So go there. You don't have to keep it all in your head, I promise.